I think that at least one entry into the potential for leveraging the evolution of consciousness begins with a sympathetic understanding of why people think the way they think. Right, so you mentioned physicalism or scientific materialism, right? The idea that the universe is just matter in motion, and there are many sophisticated nuances around that. Many philosophies that try to solve the problem of how consciousness emerges from the brain as they see it. But recognizing that this materialistic worldview is in a sense it's an agreement that creates a level of transcendence within modernity itself, right? So modernism's job in history is to break free of religion. And one of the ways it does that is it creates its own kind of religious belief system around the fiction that the universe is purely material. And that becomes a kind of a scripture that defines people's identity, right? So if you're a hard-headed scientific materialist, there's no argument that's going to persuade you because it's in your identity. Just like there's no argument that's going to persuade, a devoted evangelical Christian that part of the Bible story is allegorical, right? They want to take it literally, and that's who they are, and that's where they're standing, right? So it's not something that you can argue your way into change. I think that scientific materialism as a philosophical reality frame is falling apart at the seams as we, in this moment, right? That more and more books are coming out. More and more materialists are writing books to say this has got to be wrong, right? There's more to it than this, right? And so the evident, sort of cultural glasses that make people think that the universe is a purely material thing and that we're just kind of an accident and that our consciousness is some kind of an illusion that's being created by the electrical firing of our neurons. Sympathy towards that view begins by recognizing how this isolation of the physical, right, that begins in the Enlightenment, it begins as a method. Right? The method of scientific experiment and empirical observation, that then grows beyond the confines of a method and becomes an ontology, right? As you've pointed out. So there are people who are, in a sense, respected figures within modernist culture that are pointing out through strong arguments why that's a mistaken or too narrow a view. But again, those arguments by themselves aren't going to get the job done because although modernity claims to be highly rational and interested in evidence, what counts as evidence is defined by their worldview in the first place, right? So again, there's plenty of people that can be persuaded, but not necessarily the thought leaders who are, Richard Dawkins is not going to be persuaded. He may say, well, I realize that I'm a cultural Christian and that although I don't believe any of that nonsense, I realize that it was probably a mistake for us to try to completely dissolve Christianity as a social structure in our society. Hello. But I think that there are many fronts by which the lever of evolution is occurring, right? Philosophy is certainly one of them. An extremely powerful philosophy book was just released several weeks ago called All Things Are Full of Gods by David Bentley Hart, where he dismantles materialism. He takes on every front of it. I mean, it's a book on the philosophy of mind, what is consciousness? And although, his ultimate conclusion may not be for everybody, his demonstration of the fallacies that are associated with all of these different attempts to try to locate consciousness as a product of the brain, it's another major blow to the credibility of this materialistic worldview. But we still have, other thought leaders who are, more famous and more influential, like Yuval Harari, right? Hardcore materialist. He recognizes that there's consciousness and culture, but he calls those imaginary. It's like a fiction, right? He doesn't give it any ontological status, and that's because he's obliged to do so because he's, he's committed to this materialistic ontology. So when he talks about humans are just like an algorithm, and our consciousness is just like a piece of software, and that eventually we're going to get to the singularity where computers can duplicate that hardware more effectively to get super intelligence. I mean, there's those assertions are based on I would say, outworn philosophical belief systems that are similar to the idea that the world is created in 6 days. We know better now. And so I don't want to spend too much time railing against materialism, but certainly the synthesis has to stake out new goodness, new truth, new beauty. It has to draw a wider circle of inclusion. It has to do all these positive things, but it also has to, in a sense, transcend these earlier. It has to transcend both modernism and postmodernism, and that involves transcending some of the commitments to the good, the true, and the beautiful that prevail in those worldviews. So transcending modernity, the philosophy is at the foundation of it, or at least one of the cornerstones. And so, in a sense, overcoming the philosophy of materialism is a very important job within the larger project of building a synthetic next step. We also have to overcome the philosophy of postmodernism, right? So if the philosophy of modernism is a physicalist, and the philosophy of postmodernism is relativist, right? So that nothing is better than something else, and indeed anything that's claimed to be better is bound to be some kind of assertion of power. All hierarchies must be flattened. All authority must be suspect. That does move the dial somewhat, right? The hermeneutics of suspicion, as it's been called within postmodern philosophy, does right to question these received structures, right? So it makes some progress. But ultimately, if all you're doing is tearing down and deconstructing, and if it's purely negative, that's what the antithesis does. But the antithesis' value is ultimately demonstrated by its ability to create a platform for the synthesis. So overcoming relativism and recognizing that we can say some things are better than others. And indeed, the average person, unless they've been corrupted by philosophy, does think they're not creating value by just whatever they think is valuable, that some things out there are more valuable, and then they're capable of getting it wrong. And this is not an argument for, let me just say one more thing, this is not an argument for the objectivity of value. Value is not simply objective like electric energy. It requires the subjective. It's got to be valuable for someone. So all three major domains, but the objective, subjective, and intersubjective are involved in the evolution of consciousness and culture. But that's getting somewhat philosophically woolly. So it would take me a while to unpack that.